This is the story of Daniel and his wife, Elena of Islo. They had been together for 4 years before Daniel proposed on a Tuesday evening in their kitchen, not somewhere grand, just standing beside the stove while pasta boiled over. Laura had said yes without hesitation, and for a while that mattered more to Daniel than anything orchestrated could have. But the engagement had stretched across 18 months of planning, and somewhere inside that stretch of seating charts and catering deposits, something between them had grown quieter than it should have. Daniel noticed it the way you notice a room getting cold. Not at the moment it happens, but when you finally look up and realize you've been shivering for some time. This is a story about pride wearing the mask of patience, about the particular silence of a man who sees everything and says nothing, and about the way love doesn't always end with an argument. Sometimes it ends with someone choosing a different table. The brunch was Laura's idea, but Daniel had made the reservations. That was how most things worked between them. She would conceive of something, a vacation, a dinner party, the engagement party itself, and Daniel would find the venue, confirm the head count, send the reminder texts. He didn't resent it exactly. He had told himself for years that he was someone who expressed care through logistics, and he believed that to be true. What he had not examined was whether logistics, on their own, constituted love. The restaurant was called Oleander. It was the kind of place with cloth napkins and small plates and a brunch menu that used the word artisanal twice. Laura had seen it featured somewhere online and said it looked like exactly the right atmosphere for meeting both families before the wedding. Daniel had called ahead and arranged for the back terrace, which was private enough for toasts and loud enough with ambient noise that no one would feel the pressure of silence. Both families arrived within 10 minutes of each other. Daniel's mother, Constance, came with his younger sister, Bet, who was 8 months pregnant and in a mood that oscillated between warmth and exhaustion. His father, Gerald, who had been divorced from Constance for 11 years but managed to behave in her presence with a civility they had never managed while married, arrived separately and sat beside Bet, patting her hand like she was 12. Laura's family was smaller. Her mother, Renata, a woman with excellent posture and an expression that had long ago settled into pleasant unreadability, and her older brother, Will, who worked in commercial real estate and had the handshake of someone who needed you to know it. Laura arrived last, which was usual. She wore a dress Daniel hadn't seen before, coral-colored, with a neckline that made Renata glance away, and Will nod the way men nod when they're deciding not to say something. Daniel stood when she came to the table, kissed her cheek, pulled out her chair. She smiled at him but didn't quite look at him. That too was usual lately. The first hour passed the way such gatherings always do. Overlapping introductions, menu consultations, the cautious warmth of people who need each other to get along. Constance asked Laura about the flowers, which had been decided months ago. Gerald asked about the honeymoon and mispronounced Amalfi. Renata spoke with the careful enthusiasm of someone who had prepared talking points. Will checked his phone twice and apologized once. Daniel watched all of it and ate his eggs and felt, beneath the pleasant noise of the table, the specific hollowness of a man performing a life he was no longer entirely sure was his. He and Laura had not fought in 3 months. He had once believed that was a sign of a mature relationship. He understood now that it was a sign of nothing, or rather of absence, the absence of enough investment to argue. Laura no longer disagreed with him about anything, which meant she was no longer paying enough attention to find anything worth disagreeing about. He had noticed the phone, first. Not anything specific, no messages he'd seen, no incriminating screen left open, just the way she moved with it now. A slight turn of the shoulder, a habit of placing it face down that she hadn't had before. Small things, the kind of things that, if you mentioned them, could be explained away in seconds and would make you sound paranoid for having noticed. Daniel had not mentioned them. He refilled Laura's water glass without being asked, and she said thank you without looking up. And across the table, his mother watched this small exchange with an expression she smoothed away before he could read it. The mimosas came. Will made a toast about new beginnings, which was vague enough to be inoffensive. Daniel raised his glass and smiled. He had known for 9 weeks, not the full shape of it yet, that had come later. But enough. A name, forwarded absently in a work email she'd shown him. A specific laugh on the phone, behind the closed door of the bathroom. Nothing dramatic, nothing that arrived like a revelation. Just a slow accumulation of small, unremarkable facts that, arranged in sequence, told a story he hadn't asked to read. He had not said a word. Not to Laura, not to anyone. He had made other calls, quietly, in the weeks that followed. The wedding venue, the caterer, the photographer, not canceling outright. He wasn't ready for that, didn't want the questions it would generate, but stalling. Asking about rescheduling options, discovering, without pressing, the precise conditions under which deposits could be recovered. The morning was going smoothly. The food was good. His sister made everyone laugh, describing her daughter's name negotiations with her husband. Laura smiled genuinely at this. And for a moment she looked like someone Daniel recognized, and it made something in his chest go very still. He was reaching for his coffee when Laura set down her fork. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't look nervous. She looked, Daniel would think later, like someone who had made peace with something in the car on the way over, and was now simply executing a plan. "I need to say something," she said. The table quieted. "I'm calling off the wedding." The sentence landed in the way that sentences like that do, not with immediate noise, but with a thick, spreading silence, the kind that crowds out air. Renata's hand stopped moving toward her glass. Constance went very still. Bet looked at Daniel with the expression of someone watching a car begin to slide on ice. Laura continued, her voice level. "I'm sorry to do this here, but I thought—" She paused, and in the pause Daniel heard her recalibrate. "I don't love you anymore, Daniel. I haven't for a while. And it's not fair to either of us to keep pretending." Gerald said, "Now I've met someone," Laura said, and she didn't look at Daniel when she said it. "Someone I have real feelings for, and I think we all deserve honesty over. Thank you." Daniel's voice was quiet. It stopped her mid-sentence. He set down his cup. He looked at Laura with an expression no one at the table could fully name. Not hurt, not rage, not the shattered dignity they were all bracing to witness. Something steadier than any of those things. "Thank you," he said again, for finally being honest. The silence at the table shifted. It was a particular kind of silence. The kind that forms when an audience expects a scene and is offered, instead, composure. Renata was the first to look away. Will had stopped pretending to consult his phone. Constance had one hand on the tablecloth near her water glass, not touching it, just there, as though she needed to know something solid was close. Laura blinked. Whatever she had prepared herself for, it had not been this. "I don't," she began. "You don't have to explain," Daniel said. "I mean that. You don't owe me an explanation right now, in front of everyone. We can talk privately whenever you're ready." He picked up his coffee. "But I want you to know that I'm not surprised." Not surprised. She repeated it the way people repeat something when the words don't arrange properly in their mind. "I've known for a while, Laura." He said her name carefully, without weight, long enough to have taken care of most of the practical things. He glanced at his mother, briefly, an acknowledgement that she was hearing this at the same time as everyone else, and that he was sorry for it. "The venue deposit is mostly recoverable. I've already spoken to the caterer. The photographer has another booking that weekend, actually, so that worked out cleanly." He paused. "I didn't cancel anything outright because I wanted to give you the chance to tell me yourself. I kept thinking you would." Laura's face had changed. The prepared calm she'd arrived with had developed something underneath. Not guilt, exactly. More like the unsettled feeling of a person who has rehearsed a conversation for weeks, only to find the other person already knows their lines. "Daniel," she said, and now there was an edge in her voice. Not cruelty. Something rawer than that. "You're making it sound—" "I'm not making it sound like anything," he said. "I'm telling you what happened on my end. That's all." Bet made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a word. Gerald put his hand briefly on the table and then removed it. Will had the expression of a man calculating. The waiter appeared at the edge of the terrace, clocked something in the atmosphere and retreated. Renata said softly, Laura. Laura didn't look at her mother. She was looking at Daniel with an expression that Daniel recognized, finally, as the one she'd been holding back. Not love, not relief at having said the thing, but a kind of embarrassment that she was reframing, even now, into something more defensible. You knew, she said, and you just what? You just kept going? You let me sit here and do this in front of both families, knowing that you knew. You chose the setting, Daniel said, without inflection. Not me. The table went very quiet again. He wasn't being cruel. That was the thing that would be hardest, afterward, for anyone there to describe. There was no cruelty in his voice, no performance of injury or dignity. He sounded like a man who had already grieved something and was now simply present in the aftermath, trying to get through the next hour without causing more damage than had already been caused. His name is Owen Beckett, Daniel said. He picked up his fork, put it down again. He works in your building. Marketing, I think. He drives a gray Volvo, which I mention only because you told me 3 months ago your work was making you take the bus due to parking, and when I drove by once to pick you up for dinner, his car was in the lot and you were waiting out front. He stopped. I want you to understand that I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because I don't want to have a conversation in 2 weeks where you wonder how much I knew and I have to start from the beginning. Renata set down her glass very carefully. Bet said quietly, Oh. Laura's jaw moved. You've been tracking. I haven't been tracking anything, Daniel said. I've been noticing. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. I noticed because I was paying attention to you. That's all. Something crossed her face at that. Not guilt, but something adjacent to it, something that might, if she let herself sit with it long enough, become guilt. She didn't let herself sit with it long enough. Owen we have something real, she said, and it came out more quietly than she'd meant it to, the way statements do when you say them aloud and they sound different than they did in your head. No one responded to this. The ambient noise of the restaurant, voices from inside, a distant clink of dishes, seemed suddenly too present. I hope so, Daniel said. He meant it, in the particular way that people mean things that contain no warmth, but are nonetheless true. He hoped, genuinely, that she had not done what she had done for something that would evaporate. Not for her sake, for the sake of the version of her he had loved, the one he'd stood with in the kitchen while pasta boiled over, who had said yes without needing anything more elaborate than a moment. It was Constance who noticed her first. She was sitting 2 tables inside, partially visible through the terrace doorway, a woman in a pale yellow jacket who had been there when they arrived and whom none of them had thought to look at twice. She was looking at the terrace now. She had been looking for some time. Constance said, Daniel. He followed her gaze. The woman in the yellow jacket stood up slowly, the way people stand when their legs aren't cooperating. She had a phone in her hand, though she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at Laura. That's Meg Beckett, Will said, from across the table, his voice strange and flat. Owen Beckett's wife. He set his phone face down on the table. I know her from a deal last fall. She was there. He stopped. He looked at Laura. She's been sitting there this whole time. The color left Laura's face as though someone had simply subtracted it. Meg Beckett walked through the terrace doorway without hurrying. She was perhaps 35, with the kind of stillness about her that suggested she had already passed through her own version of this morning, the private one, before arriving. Her yellow jacket was buttoned. Her expression was not the expression of a woman who had just discovered something. It was the expression of a woman confirming it. She stopped a few feet from Laura and said nothing for a moment. The table was completely silent. Bet had gone slightly gray. Renata had placed both hands in her lap. Gerald was looking at the middle distance in the particular way of men who have learned that waiting is frequently the only available option. I don't want to make a scene, Meg said. Her voice was level, a little flat, the way voices go when the emotion behind them is too large to let through. "I'm not here to do that." She looked at Laura directly, not with hatred. Something drier. "I just needed to see you," she said. "I've known about you for about 6 weeks. I needed to put a face to." She stopped. Restarted. "Owen told me it wasn't serious. He said it was already over." She nodded slightly, almost to herself, as if filing something. "I see that it wasn't," Laura said. "I didn't know he was." "Yes, you did," Meg said, without raising her voice at all. "He has a daughter. She's 4. She drew a picture for his office that he keeps above his monitor. I've seen your messages, and you've asked about her by name." A pause. "Her name is Clara. You called her sweet." The terrace had acquired the quality of a room in which everyone was trying very hard not to breathe audibly. Laura opened her mouth. "Please don't," Meg said. It wasn't a demand. It was something more tired than a demand. "Please don't tell me you didn't know, or that you're sorry, or that it just happened. I'm not going to shout at you. I'm just going to go home and figure out what I'm doing with my life." She looked at Daniel for the first time. "I'm sorry for your part in this." Daniel nodded once. Meg turned and walked back through the door. Through the interior glass, they watched her collect her coat from the back of her chair, put it on, leave 3 bills on the table, and walk out of the restaurant with the same unhurried pace she'd arrived with. No one spoke for a very long time. Will poured himself more water and didn't drink it. Renata said, "Laura, in the way you say someone's name when you don't know the sentence that should come after it." Laura was still sitting. She hadn't moved since Meg's first word. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was looking at a spot between them with an expression that was working very hard at being composed and not entirely succeeding. But shifted in her chair, one hand on her stomach, and said quietly to Daniel, "Do you want to go?" Daniel considered. "In a minute," he said. He looked at Laura, and she felt him looking, and she looked up. There was nothing theatrical in what passed between them. No long speech gathering in his throat. What he felt, he would not have been able to articulate then. Not grief, not satisfaction, not anger. A kind of clearness, maybe. The particular clearness of a situation that has resolved itself into the shape it was always going to take, once you stop trying to alter it. "I'm going to pay the bill," he said. "Then I'm going to take my mother in bed home." He paused. "I hope everything works out the way you need it to." She looked at him, and he thought she might say something that would require him to answer, some attempt at justification or apology or the reopening of something. But she didn't. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was private enough that he looked away from it. He found their waiter near the interior bar, paid for all of it, both families, all 3 courses, the mimosas, and returned to the table to collect his mother and sister. Gerald offered to drive Constance, and Daniel, without discussion, let him. He walked out into the street, which was bright and ordinary, full of people doing other things entirely. He had driven 6 blocks before he noticed that he felt, for the first time in months, something that was very close to relief. By July, the world had rearranged itself into new patterns, the way it does, indifferently, without announcing that it's doing so. Daniel was living in the apartment they'd shared. Laura had moved out the week after the brunch, efficiently, in a way that told him she'd already made arrangements. She had taken her books, her kitchen things, the lamp she'd bought at a flea market that he had never much liked, and left behind 2 boxes of items that were clearly hers, but which she hadn't wanted badly enough to come back for. He put them in the hall closet and didn't think about them. He heard through Will, who reached out once, awkwardly, to apologize on behalf of nothing in particular, that Owen Beckett had not left his wife, that Meg had apparently decided to stay, at least for now, the calculus of marriages being what it is, that Owen had described the thing with Laura as a moment of poor judgment, which was the kind of phrase that, once it reaches its destination, tends to land hard. Daniel did not feel satisfaction at this information. He had thought he might, and the absence of it surprised him. He was sleeping better, which he hadn't expected. He was cooking more, which he also hadn't expected. He spent a Sunday afternoon in June reorganizing the bookshelves in a way that was entirely his own. And when he was done, he stood back and looked at them and felt something that was small but unambiguous. Work helped in the practical way. Work always helps. It gave structure to the shapeless early weeks, filled the hours that might otherwise have become self-examination. He was a project manager for a civil engineering firm, which was not the career he had imagined at 22, but had become, over the years, something he was genuinely good at, which he had learned to value more than the thing he'd imagined. He managed a bridge rehabilitation project that summer, a small one, over a river outside the city, and there was something in the daily concreteness of it. Materials, deadlines, load-bearing calculations that he found, that season, more comforting than beauty. Laura texted him in May, a measured message. 3 careful paragraphs that used the phrase "I think we both knew" twice, and "I'm not the person you needed me to be" once, and which was clearly something she had written and rewritten. He read it twice, replied with 2 sentences, that he wished her well, that there was no need to apologize, and then let the thread go quiet. She texted again in late June, this time shorter, less composed. Just, "I've been thinking about the beginning." The Tuesday in the kitchen. "Do you think we should have been paying attention to something different earlier?" He sat with that message for most of an evening. What he could not say to her, and what he knew she was partly asking him to deny, was yes. Yes, he had not been paying enough attention, not to the things that mattered, her silences, her restlessness, the particular way she had begun to describe her days as something that happened to her rather than something she inhabited. He had been good at logistics. He had not been good at presence. He had loved her in the way he was best at loving, which turned out to have been the wrong way for what she needed, and the failure was not only hers. He wrote back, "I think we were both paying attention to the wrong things. I'm sorry for my part in that." She didn't respond. He thought that was right. Bet had her daughter in late June, a girl they named Iris, which suited her immediately. Daniel went to the hospital and held her for 20 minutes while Bet ate a sandwich and told him he looked better than he had in 2 years, which was, he understood, meant as kindness. He was trying to decide whether it was accurate when Iris made a sound against his shoulder that was small and warm and completely disinterested in anything he was processing, and he found himself laughing, briefly with real surprise. His mother called more often that summer. She didn't mention Laura much. Mostly she talked about her garden, her book club, a neighborhood dispute about a fence. He found himself looking forward to the calls. He had not looked forward to much recently. By August, he had started running again. Something he'd abandoned in the first year of the engagement, when the weekends filled up with wedding planning and the mornings shortened. He ran along the river path near his apartment in the early hours before the heat came, and the city was very quiet that early, and he found the quiet easier to be in than he had expected. He had not started seeing anyone. Several people mentioned this as a state of affairs requiring remedy, and he declined politely the various remedies offered. What he had arrived at that summer was a tentative clarity about what he did not want to repeat. He had been good at commitment in the abstract, arrangements, deposits, plans, and less good at the daily, unstructured practice of knowing someone, staying curious about them, letting them be complicated rather than filed under a heading. He didn't know yet how to do that differently, but he could feel the question opening up in him for the first time as a real question rather than an assessment of someone else's failure. September came. The air changed. He finished the bridge project and stood on it for a while one evening, watching the water below, and thought about the fact that nothing he was standing on had existed 2 years ago, and now it would stand for 60 years, and the thought was not as simple as it seemed, but he didn't press it into meaning. He had not seen Laura since April. She called in September, which he hadn't expected. The text had been one thing, the call was another, and when her name appeared on his screen, he stood in the kitchen for a moment before answering. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. There was a pause after the greeting, long enough to have its own weight, short enough that neither of them had to address it. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," she said. "I almost didn't." She seemed to accept that. He heard something in the background. A window, wind, the suggestion of a different room and a different life. "I'm in my mother's city for the week," she said. "Renata wanted me to come up. I think she's been lonely." "How is she?" "Managing." A brief sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. She doesn't say much about what happened. She asks about my work, my apartment, whether I'm eating properly. Somehow that's worse. Daniel leaned against the counter. The kitchen was evening lit, amber through the window, and he was in the middle of making dinner. Something simple, something he'd made enough times that his hands could do it without his attention. He turned off the stove. "What did you want to call about, Laura?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know exactly," she said, and he believed her. "I've been thinking about something Meg said at the restaurant." She paused. "She said she needed to see me to put a face to something. And I keep thinking about that. About how I was a face to her. Not a person. Just evidence." "You weren't only evidence to her," Daniel said. "She knew your name. She'd read your messages." "That's not what I mean." Her voice had a careful quality, the kind that develops around something still tender. "I mean that to her, I was a thing that happened to her life, and I think—" She stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about whether that's what I made you into, a thing that happened to mine." He stayed quiet. "I want to say it was complicated," she said. "That I was lonely and you weren't, that we weren't." She stopped. He heard her take a breath. "But actually, I think it was simpler than that. I think I made a decision and I dressed it up as something it wasn't. And I've been trying to figure out since April whether that was about you or about me, and I think—" Another pause, longer. "I think it was mostly about me." Daniel looked at the window. The light was going. "I think I could have paid more attention," he said finally. "Not to what you were doing. To you. What you needed." He wasn't sure what he expected to happen when he said it. Nothing dramatic. Just the thing being said. "I was good at planning for us, and not always good at being present in us. I know that." "Don't absolve me," she said. It wasn't sharp. It was something else, close to a request. "I'm not," he said. "These can both be true." She was quiet again. He could hear her breathing, barely, and it made her suddenly very real to him. Not the figure from the restaurant, not the version of her he'd been living alongside the past several months, but the actual person, sitting somewhere in her mother's house, holding a phone, trying to be honest. "I'm not going to ask if we could have done it differently," she said. "I know we're going to say we could have, and I know that's true, but I don't think that changes what it was." "No," he said, "it doesn't. I think I called because I needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the obvious thing. The other part, the part where I let you keep making reservations and plans and deposits while I was already somewhere else. I let you keep building something, and I didn't stop you." Her voice was careful, but underneath the care was something that had been pressing outward for some time. That was unkind. He stayed with that word, unkind. Not the word he might have chosen months ago, but he understood why she'd chosen it. It was smaller and more accurate than the words he'd carried in the early weeks. It reached further back, into smaller moments. It was right. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'm not being gracious. I mean it." Outside, the last light had completed its withdrawal. The apartment was quiet in the way he had grown accustomed to. Not the quiet of absence exactly, but a quiet that was simply its own thing. "I should go," she said. "Renata made dinner." "Tell her hello," he said, and found that he meant it. "I will." She paused. Daniel. Yeah, I hope you're okay. I mean, I hope you're actually okay, not just managing. He thought about August mornings on the running path, about Iris sleeping against his shoulder, about the bridge over the river that would stand for 60 years for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the work. I think I'm getting there, he said, slowly. Good, she said. That's good. She hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while. In the dark, he hadn't thought to address and let the conversation settle. He didn't replay it, looking for the thing he should have said differently. He thought about her sitting in her mother's house, and about Meg Beckett, and about the way all of them had been the face of something to someone else. Evidence, proof, context, and how rarely any of them had simply been seen. He turned the stove back on, finished making dinner, ate it at the table instead of over the sink, which had become, without his quite deciding it, a small act of intention. There was no resolution in the phone call, not in the way stories often promise resolution. No door fully closed, no accounting settled. What there was instead was the thin but real feeling of two people who had failed each other in different ways, meeting briefly in the middle of something they both understood, and then going back to their separate lives and carrying the understanding with them. That, Daniel thought, was probably as much as two people could honestly offer each other, once the rest of it had passed. He washed his plate. The city continued outside. The night was ordinary and sufficient, and he moved through it, slowly, without quite knowing what came next, but less afraid of not knowing than he had been in some time.